Thank you all so much for being here this evening. I am very excited to talk to you about this exhibition that I've been working on for the past 4 years. So without further ado, I guess we will jump right in. Few people have been so important to the story of American art, and yet so little known, as Edith Gregor Halpert. In 1926, at the age of 26, Halpert founded the Downtown Gallery in New York City. From a modest space in Greenwich Village, she propelled modern American art to the forefront of public attention at a time when the European avant-garde still enthralled the world. The list of exceptional artists she championed is long. Stuart Davis, Jacob Lawrence, Georgia O'Keeffe, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, Ben Shahn, Charles Sheeler, William Zorach, and dozens of others were among the artists that she represented at the Downtown Gallery. And I know that many of these names will be familiar to you, I'm sure, as most of the artists on this screen were either members or students or instructors, often for years at the Art Students League, either during the period they were at the Downtown Gallery or before or after. Halpert, who herself was an immigrant, a woman, and a Jew, saw the diversity of American artists and their eclectic creative styles as powerful expressions of the nation's democracy. Embracing the idea of pluralism, she forged a radically inclusive definition of American art that is still in use. Halpert also mined the country's past for hidden treasures. She rediscovered many neglected painters of the 19th century who are now considered canonical, including William Michael Harnett, Edward Hicks, and Raphaelle Peale. Perhaps most unexpected was her delight in the genre of folk art, then almost unknown. Its popularity today is due in great part to her enthusiasm. But Halpert had more than just a good eye for overlooked talent. She was also a pioneer in art marketing. By cultivating patrons with an interest in culture and the means to support it, she influenced many of the nation's great public art institutions. Today, her entrepreneurial spirit is present in the collections of museums across the United States, even if her name is absent from their walls. With her endless energy and her extraordinary business acumen, Halpert inspired generations of Americans to value the art of their own country in their own time. And this image that I'm showing you here, this is our main promotional image for the show that's currently up at the Jewish Museum. This is actually Halpert in 1952, several years, even decades even, into her career when she's really kind of at the height of her fame. I love how powerfully this photograph communicates just how central a force she was in the art world at mid-century, and also that she was a woman at the center of it all in this incredibly male-dominated field. These are 6 of the younger artists that she was beginning to show that year in 1952. It's still a very male-dominated field, but getting better. So just to shift back in time a little bit to the beginning, to just talk a bit about her early biography and her connections even to the Art Students League. Edith Halpert was born in 1900. She was the younger of 2 sisters, and she was born into a prosperous Jewish family in Odessa. Her father, Gregor, had a successful career in the grain business, but he died of tuberculosis in 1904. The next year, more than 400 Odessan Jews were murdered during a violent surge of anti-Semitism following the Russian Revolution of 1905. So Edith left Odessa with her mother and her sister to join extended family who had already settled in America. When they arrived in New York City in 1906, they were just 3 of the more than 150,000 Eastern European Jews who immigrated to the United States in that year alone. But unlike the majority of Ellis Island's new arrivals, they had money, which allowed them to settle in a well-to-do Jewish neighborhood in West Harlem. Her mother, however, soon lost her savings in bad investments and was then compelled to open a stationery and candy store below the family's apartment. And Edith helped behind that counter at a very young age. She was about 12 or 13, I think, when she started working in the family business. Not far from her home was the National Academy of Design, then located at Amsterdam and 109th Street. And young as she was, she felt a powerful attraction to the place. By the time she was a sophomore in high school, at 14, she was supplementing her coursework with evening classes there. Now, in order to be allowed to enroll, she had to claim to be 16. So she kind of forged her documents a bit. And as a young woman, she also had to promise to remain in the hallway and work from plaster casts, while men were allowed to draw from a live model inside the studio. So the few female students who were studying at the National Academy at the time were not allowed to see such things in mixed company. Halpert recalled that she quickly found a workaround for this. She claimed that she bore a hole in the door of the classroom so she could see inside. And the live sketches that she and her female compatriots created had to remain hidden from her professors, like contraband. So this is a picture of her around the time that she was taking those classes, about 14, 15 years old, in Central Park, where she would often go on the weekends to sketch and paint. A few years on, she received funding to attend the Art Students League. Here we are. Where women could more easily study from the nude and learn not just to sketch, but to paint. Edith later recalled, "I was so excited about the whole thing that I bought the biggest palette in America. I had the most awful callus on my left thumb just holding the thing. It weighed a ton." She studied here with George Bridgman, who encouraged her burgeoning talent. Still, Edith wanted to do things her way. She explained, "When I decided that I didn't like his kind of teaching where you had to work on the same thing all week, I started a quick sketch class. I was always the youngest, always one of the very few girls, and I said, why do we have to do this? Why don't we have quick poses and really learn something about the human figure?" Bridgman caught us, and he threatened to have me thrown out because I was ruining the class. So what you're seeing here is a photograph from about 1910, so around the time that Edith would have been here, and this is a class of strictly all female students working from the nude, but at least they were allowed to work from a live model. Edith also eagerly rode the subway from her home in Harlem down to Greenwich Village to take the weekly live sketching classes held at the Whitney Studio Club, and to hobnob with real artists, both established and striving, luminaries of the Ashcan School, George Bellows, Robert Henry, and George Lukes, and younger modernists like Stuart Davis and Niles Spencer. Always a close observer and a quick study, she remembers that she used to sit at the back of the classroom and watch and learn from the others. So I paired this with this wonderful lithograph by Mabel Dwight of a life class that took place at the Whitney Studio Club, early 1930s. So I love this image. Mabel Dwight's work is so just wonderful in the way she captures a kind of satirical take on gender dynamics in American culture in general. But here you see that men and women were allowed to sketch from the nude in mixed company, and perhaps Halpert may have identified with the two women who are seen here in the classroom. And she would later exhibit this lithograph years later in the 30s at her gallery. Edith also became involved with the People's Art Guild, a progressive artists cooperative. Its mission was to bring together artists and immigrant communities on the poverty-stricken Lower East Side, to bring avant-garde art to the masses, and to open up new markets for artists. At age 17, Halpert became its treasurer, and its progressive ethos was a primary influence on her when, a decade later, she founded the Downtown Gallery. Edith formed lasting friendships with artists at the Guild, notably Marguerite and William Zorach, who designed a lot of the posters and, for example, the membership card for the Guild as well. The Zorachs would later be among the first artists to join her gallery. But one painter in particular caught her eye, and that was Samuel Halpert. So according to family lore, Edith saw one of his paintings in the window of a New York City gallery around October of 1916, and she declared, I shall marry the man who painted that picture. And then, lo and behold, she met Samuel at the People's Art Guild popular Forward Building exhibition a few months later. And she just immediately fell in love with the artist whose painting had so dazzled her. The courtship was brief. They married within a year, shortly after her 18th birthday. And she later commented, "I married with a feeling I had married American art." It's such a lovely sentiment. The marriage did not work out. But at this point, Edith abandoned her own dream of becoming an artist. For a time, Halpert assumed the classic role of the Artist Muse, and she became Samuel's main model, appearing in a number of his domestic scenes in the early and mid-1920s. And this is actually a pretty singular portrait that he did of her. Most of the time she's just kind of seen like in the background or at a distance, but this is a real fully fledged portrait that he did of her shortly after she began her business. Despite Samuel Halpert's established reputation in New York and Paris, his paintings earned at best $800 a year, hardly enough to sustain a family. Edith became the breadwinner. She had been working to support her widowed mother and herself since she was 14. She had held a succession of department store jobs, writing and illustrating advertisements, among other duties, and incidentally learning a great deal about retail, particularly the differing strategies aimed at working middle and upper class markets. Then in 1920, she took a lucrative consulting position at an investment bank, calling herself a systematizer or efficiency expert. By age 25, she was making $6,000 a year and had earned $10,000 in bonuses, and she held a seat on the bank's board of directors. So, age of 25, she's one of the few female executives working on Wall Street. Ultimately, Edith distilled the fruits of a decade's worth of business experience and immersion in the art world into a singular, clear idea. She would open an art gallery, one that would show the work of her contemporaries and that would help to maintain and develop their careers. She used her sizable savings to purchase a building at 113 West 13th Street. She lived there and took in tenants whose rent would help sustain her commercial venture on the ground floor. So what you see in the photograph here, it says in nice bold letters, the Downtown Gallery. Her modern art showrooms were on that garden level of the brownstone, and then about 5 years later, she would open up the second floor as a second folk art gallery, which we'll talk about in a minute. In 1926, when Halpert opened the Downtown Gallery, most New York art galleries were in Midtown. Furnished in red plush and mahogany, they catered to an elite clientele, primarily showing old masters and French Impressionists. Halpert preferred bohemian Greenwich Village, where artists lived and where customers of all income levels would feel welcome. Her gallery was different in other ways, too. Its rooms were modern and stylish, and the artists she showed there were often young and radical. At first, she simply called her venture Our Gallery, signaling the democratic nature of her enterprise. Her motto was simple: Our gallery has no special prejudice for any school. Its selection is directed by what's enduring, not by what is in vogue. With her considerable business experience, the Downtown Gallery quickly attracted serious collectors, most notably Abby Eldridge Rockefeller. And under Halpert's direction, many of her patrons went on to build new museums or donate major collections of American art to public institutions across the country. Although she enjoyed these relationships, Halpert never lost sight of her most important clients, just everyday men and women who simply loved art and wanted to live with it. And I love this really sweet portrait that Marguerite Zorach did of Edith Halpert around 1930, where we see her kind of closing a deal with one of her, I call him a gentleman caller, but he's a client. And she had, in addition to really up-to-the-minute art in her gallery, also very contemporary furniture as well. She had a part of her space is designed by Donald Dusky, who's a major Art Deco designer, so the swivel chairs and the table between them were also designed by him, and they were meant to be just very comfortable, and you could sit with your clients and smoke a cigarette and hold artwork at the same time, which as a curator makes me crazy. But this is how she would do her business. You would get comfortable. It was kind of like a domestic setting there, like that. Halpert also set affordable prices and offered installment plans, sales strategies familiar in merchandising, but unheard of in the rarefied art world. She refused to perpetuate the snob appeal of collecting. American art, she believed, belonged to the American people. So this is one of my favorite items of ephemera that I discovered in the course of researching the show, and it's included in our exhibition. The brochure, it's from much later on, from 1950, but it's a kind of rebus. It's like a very jazzy kind of thing, so I'll read it as if all the illustrations are words. Instead of a diamond ring, or a limousine, or a fur coat, or a TV set, why not give a painting by any number of downtown gallery artists that you see listed within the frame, from $25 to $5,000. So these are 1950 prices. In the early years, it would have probably been about 25 to 100, maybe a little bit more, 250. But I love this very jaunty ad and how it showed that contemporary art could and should be treated like any other popular commodity. And that it was often more affordable than other aspirational goods. So this is directly drawing on her kind of experience working in department stores and how to sell. Halpert's first display at the Downtown Gallery was a group show. As you can see, she deliberately presented her gallery as a domestic space, preserving the brownstone's original fireplace, for instance, so that clients could imagine what art might look like in their own homes. The centerpiece of this exhibition was an embroidered tapestry by Marguerite Zorach, and a sculpture by Ellie Nodelman was beside it, set on a painted chest rather than a pedestal. The juxtaposition of modern art and folk furniture was an early sign of Halpert's interest in folk material, although she did not begin officially selling American folk art until a few years later. And just to show you what those works look like today, I was able to track down both of those objects and reunite them in our exhibition and in our book, which is a very exciting kind of moment. And just to say that her aim at the Downtown Gallery was to show really the most innovative artists, American artists working at the time. But interestingly enough, the very progressive kind of cutting edge artists at that time were also looking back at early American folk art in particular. Ellie Nodelman, of course, being one of the great early collectors of both American and European folk art. And you see that influence in his direct carving style and these very simple, kind of whimsical forms. And then Marguerite Zorach, of course, picking up on kind of traditional textile making, quilts, etc., for her embroidered tapestries. Halpert soon launched a robust and innovative schedule of exhibitions that quickly solidified the Downtown Gallery's reputation as the most exciting place in New York to view contemporary American art. When Stuart Davis's early experimental works made their debut at the Downtown Gallery in 1927, they caused an uproar. Halpert recalled with satisfaction, people wanted to break the windows. They would come in from the street and scream, "This is indecent, having these crazy pictures." Davis shared her commitment to bringing modern art to everyday audiences. He commented, "People who are up to date in their clothes, automobiles, apartments, and love affairs must buy this type of picture in order to be consistent." I love an artist's ego. Unfortunately, the public did not agree, and Halpert did not sell a single work from Davis's first show. It would actually take several years until the 1940s for him to achieve any kind of inkling of commercial success. But through perseverance and her unwavering support, Davis would come to be one of her most successful artists in the decades that followed. So this and his other paintings in that show, they did not sell. He wound up giving this as a gift to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who is his other kind of major patron at the time. And then this painting would go on to become one of the key works in the founding collection of the Whitney Museum when that opened in 1931. So just to note as well that when the Downtown Gallery opened in 1926, showing exclusively contemporary American art, there was no Whitney Museum, there was no Museum of Modern Art. The only museum in Manhattan at the time really was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they were emphatically not collecting or showing any contemporary American art at the time. So very different scene from what we have today, where they now have a whole building dedicated to it. So not all art was difficult to sell. Halpert had her first runaway success in 1928 with a sweeping survey of American landscapes going back to 1848. Her intention was to demonstrate that painters of the younger generation could hold their own against venerated American masters. Because she did not otherwise deal 19th century American art, Halpert sought loans from friends. Winslow Homer's shark fishing, she borrowed from an unidentified private collector through a mutual acquaintance. She hung this riveting watercolor in an alcove alongside an early mountainscape by John Marin. A huge amount of interest was generated in the Homer. One visitor offered a phenomenal $10,000 for it. But to Halpert's dismay, she was told the anonymous owner was not interested in selling. So instead, she made up her mind that she would sell the Marin to the person who already owned the Homer, keep the pair together. A few days later, a woman came into the gallery casually inquiring about the Marin watercolor. "Oh, it's not for sale," Halpert lamented. "I am holding it for the idiot who refused to sell the Homer for so much money." And the woman replied, "I am the idiot." So that idiot was Abby Eldridge Rockefeller. And that is how you make friends. They really did. They hit it off right away. Rockefeller became the patron saint of the Downtown Gallery, essentially, in its early years, and in turn, Halpert became her most trusted art advisor. In her first year as Halpert's client, she spent more than $20,000 just in 1 year alone, and that continued basically for the next decade or so. Rockefeller did not make big, expensive purchases. I was really interested to learn this. Instead, she preferred to buy small works, watercolors like the Marin we just looked at, drawings, and especially prints by multiple artists so that her philanthropy could assist as many people as possible. And the two paintings that I'm showing on the side, they're both in our exhibition. The top, the Seashell by Martin Hartley, and the White Flower by Georgia OKeefe are both very modestly sized paintings. You know, they're not like the big splashy canvases that either artist was offering at the time, but those were the works that she was really drawn to. Halpert soon began to encourage Rockefeller to turn her personal passion for collecting into a public good. Rockefeller was already thinking along those lines, and in 1929, she co-founded the Museum of Modern Art, where she would be able to exhibit and eventually donate the kind of art she felt deserved attention. Ultimately, the bulk of Rockefeller's modern art collection, a staggering 2,000 works, was given to the museum, and of these, more than 500 had been purchased from Edith, so about a quarter of her modern art collection. While other gallerists were feeling the first effects of the Depression, Halpert's business continued to grow. In 1930, she expanded her exhibition space in New York, building a freestanding, skylit building in the garden behind her brownstone, designed in an up-to-the-minute modernist aesthetic. She called it the Daylight Gallery. Designed by Duncan Candler and Donald Deskey, we talked about earlier, the aim was to create a sleek, neutral background for contemporary art, quite the opposite impression from that offered by the residential rooms in the main building. It was a single room with niches at the four corners, outfitted with revolving bases, so that sculptures could be easily viewed from every angle with the turn of a crank. And you can kind of see that, I think, in the niche in that corner that you can see there. There would have been a crank that's hidden in this particular view, but it's a nice little sales trick. Decorative features by Halpert's artists were sprinkled throughout, including a pair of door grills that flank the entrance by William Zorach. So you see the original iron grills, these beautiful Art Deco kind of stylized rams that would have been on the bottoms of the doors that you would enter the daylight gallery to. And there's William Zorach very proudly posing by his architectural elements. Although this Bauhaus-inspired gallery may appear rather generic today, Halpert pioneered the trend of showing modern art in a modern setting. Her innovative sense of design was yet another thing that set her apart from her peers. Through her connections with the Rockefeller family, Halpert became intimately involved with the decor of Radio City Music Hall. The Rockefeller Center complex was built at the height of the Depression, and Halpert was able to steer many commissions for the flashy Art Deco theater to her artists. The two murals pictured here are still in place. Kuniyoshi's mural for the Ladies' Lounge, a kind of dream garden based on a concept by Georgia O'Keeffe, and Stuart Davis's 17-foot-long cubist painting for the Men's Lounge is filled with emblems of modern masculinity. So I encourage you to please go to Radio City the next time you can. These works are absolutely spectacular. You can take a backstage tour if you want to make sure that you can get into both the men and women's lounges. William Zorach also was charged with producing an enormous figurative sculpture for the lower lounge titled Spirit of the Dance. Cast in polished aluminum, it depicts a dancer at the finale of her number. So although female nudes in art were hardly new, and Radio City would soon be home to the leggy Rockettes, this particular nude offended the theater's owner, Roxy, who demanded that it be removed just a few weeks before the grand opening. So there was a huge amount of controversy around this, but Halpert, for her part, worked the situation to her advantage, placing the original plaster version of the statue on view at her gallery and opening her exhibition a few hours before curtain time the night of Radio City's debut. The press reported that crowds of sober and indignant art lovers came in droves to see what all the fuss was about, and the New York Times called the work one of the most significant pieces of plastic art ever produced in America. Spirit of the Dance was eventually restored to its rightful place in the music hall where it graces the Grand Lounge today. So again, encourage you to go see it. Charles Sheeler joined the Downtown Gallery in 1931. In his first solo exhibition there that year, he debuted 6 paintings, including classic landscape. Today, Sheeler is best known as a painter, but at the time he was a highly regarded commercial photographer. He often used his own photographs as source material for his canvases. This one is based on pictures he took of the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge factory. While some critics praised his meticulously painted canvases, others were quick to dismiss them as so-called tinted photographs. Halpert felt that his career as a photographer was detracting from the public's perception of his painting. She persuaded him to put his commercial photography career behind him and to cease exhibiting his photographs. With the source images hidden from view, Halpert was able to recast Sheeler's style as evidence of the, quote, clarity, the purity of form, and the rigid adherence to essentials that was characteristic of the American mind, end quote. Sheeler became one of Halpert's most successful artists, due in no small part to her successful reframing of his artwork. Sheeler was also attracted to the simplicity and fine craftsmanship of folk art. Americana, another work that was in his first show at the Downtown Gallery, is based on a photograph of his own home in South Salem, New York, which he had filled with Shaker furniture and early American rugs. "I don't like these things because they are old, but in spite of it," he said, "I'd like them even better if they were made yesterday." He drew a connection between the flat patterns, subdued palette, and strict geometry of chairbacks, fabrics, and the backgammon board on the one hand, and the semi-abstract aesthetics and distorted perspective of Cubism on the other. So despite her focus on contemporary American artists, especially those with a strongly modernist bent, Halpert was also a longstanding admirer of American folk art, and a few prescient collectors, including artists like Sheeler, were noticing the beauty of such mundane objects as Shaker furniture and patchwork quilts. And Halpert also recognized the intrinsic beauty and the charm of many of these pieces. And as we saw from the outset, she placed folk objects in the downtown gallery, not necessarily to be sold, but as decor to set off the modern paintings and sculptures, as we saw in this photograph already. She did not fail to notice, however, that these proved popular and were some of the first objects purchased. So the idea of opening a second gallery dedicated to American folk art came to Halpert early. In December of 1931, she launched the American Folk Art Gallery on the second floor of her 13th Street brownstone, above her modern art showroom. Its first exhibition, titled American Ancestors, offered work by obscure and self-taught painters, predominantly of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Halpert presented these works not as sentimental heirlooms or historical curiosities, but as fine art. In the dozens of folk art exhibitions that followed, she resurrected many long-forgotten figures and established them as the forebears of her modernists. American artists, she argued, owed no debt to Europe, but rather they had their own rich vernacular traditions from which to draw inspiration. Halpert saw no conflict between folk and contemporary art. Modern artists and folk artisans often used similar visual strategies: strong silhouettes, flattened perspectives, and deliberate crudeness of form. For visitors perplexed by modernism, folk art was what she called a polar inner. Halpert taught Americans to see both as real art, worthy of aesthetic contemplation and museum display. It's actually quite startling to realize that when Halpert opened the American Folk Art Gallery, most of the now beloved classics of the genre were still unknown to the public. Edward Hicks, for example, one of the great American folk artists, was almost entirely unknown until Halpert showed one of his Peaceable Kingdom paintings in that first American Ancestors exhibition in 1931. And now today, Hicks, he painted over 60 versions of the Peaceable Kingdom, and they're in every major American art collection and every museum across the country, and dozens of those passed through the downtown gallery before now being out in the world. Another canvas, depicting an expertly painted hanging cloth, stood apart from the others for its unusually sophisticated and seductive use of trompe-l'oeil. Here, the white cloth is rendered so realistically that one is tempted to reach out to remove it to get a better look at the bather hiding behind it. When Halpert bought it from a Connecticut dealer for $75, the grimy, nearly illegible canvas had been passed over by all the major art dealers in New York. Only after Halpert sent it to be restored was the signature of Raphaelle Peale revealed, and his hidden Venus along with it. So 2 years later, word got around that a new museum was opening in Kansas City, with galleries to fill and millions to spend. This was highly unusual, especially in the Depression. Museums were not really buying American art at all, but here was this museum, the city, that just had the funds and needed to buy art. So the dealers of New York went into a frenzy, polishing antiques and refreshing their displays of Old Master and Impressionist paintings in order to entice this new client with deep pockets, as it was assumed they would, like other encyclopedic museums, only purchase work by artists who had been dead for at least 30 years. A fellow dealer taunted Halpert about this. "Well, my dear, this is one institution that you can't put your hands into because you have all living artists." And Halpert agreed. "Even if I killed one right away, I can't predate him." But folk art, she realized, and neglected 19th century masters like Peale were her secret weapon. Those were the deadest artists in the whole world, she realized. She ultimately sold this painting to the Nelson Art Gallery, now the Nelson Atkins Museum, for $5,000. So that is a 6,000% return on her original purchase. Halpert later reflected, "I have a very, very soft spot for the Nelson Atkins Museum because that art sale meant a great deal to me and to my artists at that time. But what meant the most to me was that I burned up every antiquarian in New York City." 1 year after Halpert launched her American Folk Art Gallery, the Museum of Modern Art organized the first major museum exhibition on the genre. Titled American Folk Art, The Art of the Common Man in America, this groundbreaking exhibition presented folk art as an expression of democratic and egalitarian values, lending an aura to the genre that it still enjoys today. Nearly all of the 175 objects in it, including these two iconic weather vanes, came from the private collection of Abby Eldridge Rockefeller, lent anonymously again, which she in turn had acquired from Halpert. So this, I think, just goes to show, a lot of times I get asked, why isn't Halpert better known? And I think a large part of that is so much of the work that she was doing was so behind the scenes, and so much what she was doing, what she was discovering when she was the one going out into the countryside and finding these weather vanes, and oftentimes knocking on barn doors and persuading farmers to, I'll give you $20 if you give me your weather vane, kind of searching and sleuthing out for these objects. Her name and her input kind of gets buried under, the names of like the collection of Abby Eldridge Rockefeller, or the fact that the Museum of Modern Art did the first major show. Her contributions kind of get tucked under those bigger names. Throughout the 1930s, Abby Rockefeller remained Halpert's most reliable client for both modern and folk art. But in 1938, the Rockefellers downsized from their townhouse in Midtown. They were making space for what would be the new big splashy building for MoMA, into a Park Avenue duplex. It was a very hard thing for them. So Abby Rockefeller was forced to curtail her collecting. The following year, she began to donate her beloved collection of folk art to the public, eventually giving more than 400 objects to Colonial Williamsburg, where they would form the basis of the first public museum dedicated exclusively to American folk art. With this new enterprise in mind, Rockefeller made one last major purchase from the downtown gallery, spending thousands on a group of paintings that included the boy with a finch that you see here, which is almost Goya-esque in its portrayal, as well as these charming wedding portraits. Rockefeller wrote to Halpert, "You have made a real contribution to the understanding and knowledge and appreciation of early American painting in this country, a contribution which I personally think no one else was prepared to make." Now that Rockefeller was no longer actively collecting, Halpert needed a new source of income. In April 1935, a scout in Philadelphia brought Halpert a canvas that stopped her in her tracks. Every detail of this unusual still life, from the cracks in the gun's ivory handle to the creases in the newspaper clipping pasted below it, is recorded with virtuosic precision. Almost nothing was known about the artist, whose name was painted in the corner as though it had been carved into the wooden panel. Really hard to see here in the slide reproduction. But when you come to see it at the Jewish Museum, you will see how incredibly lifelike it is. Halpert promptly offered the painting to the director of the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. She knew Harnett's uncanny work would appeal to him. Chick Austin Jr., that was his name, had staged the first surrealist exhibition in the United States at the Atheneum in 1931. And Halpert saw in this hyper-real work, with its intent focus on a single, implicitly violent object, a certain affinity with Europe's latest radical art movement. The sale was swiftly negotiated. Halpert began to exhibit Harnett's work regularly, and a mania for his paintings ensued, with buyers across the country clamoring for his work. "He was the biggest sugar daddy I ever had," she quipped. Halpert's success in selling folk art gave her the funds to move uptown, closer to where many of her clients worked and lived, and to the established galleries clustered around 57th Street. In 1940, she relocated to East 51st Street, retaining the downtown gallery names, and she was 6 blocks south of the main drag, while asserting her arrival among the leading dealers of New York. The rooms were sumptuous, with modern flourishes. The walls were covered in metal lush, a fine metal netting that Halpert invented and patented, which was both decorative, it shimmered, as you can see in the photograph here, and also practical, it concealed nail holes. She was hanging about 10 to 12 exhibitions a year, so that would just cover all of that. Soon after her arrival in Midtown, one of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance, Alan Locke, sent Halpert a copy of his new book, titled The Negro in Art. Lavishly illustrated, this groundbreaking volume included works by African and African American artists, as well as depictions of Black life in Western art. Halpert recognized immediately what had been a glaring blind spot for her, and saw an opportunity to go beyond her previous modest gestures of inclusivity. With Locke's assistance, she organized New York City's most comprehensive survey exhibition of African American art to date at the Downtown Gallery. The ambitious show featured 50 artists and nearly 100 works dating back to the 19th century and continuing right up to the present moment. So some of you may recognize the works that are on view in this photograph here. They are the Migration series. It's the most impressive work by far that was included in this exhibition. They were just recently completed by Jacob Lawrence. It was an ambitious 60-panel series on the history of the migration, the Great Migration. His distinctive style, which the artist called dynamic cubism, drew on the simplified forms of folk art and the patterns of geometric abstraction and the deep traditions of narrative history painting. The Migration series was not just a visual tour de force, but also a charged work of political import. It was a direct indictment of the violence, economic oppression, and disenfranchisement that led so many Black Americans to leave the South for northern cities. Halpert began to represent the young artist. He was 24 years old at the time, and immediately set to work finding a home for his Migration series. She expertly negotiated the joint sale of the work to the Museum of Modern Art and the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. It was agreed that one buyer would take the even numbers and the other the odd, so that each institution could maintain the integrity of the narrative arc. After the sale was finalized, MoMA sent the complete Migration series on a 2-year tour to 15 national venues, solidifying Lawrence's reputation. The association with the Downtown Gallery and Halpert's savvy marketing made the young painter a national sensation. "I always owe Edith Halpert," Lawrence said. "I think she is one of the great American dealers." Halpert also endeavored to take over affairs for another painter featured in her survey of African American art, Horace Pippin. It is easy to see why Pippin's work appealed to Halpert. His pictures merged elements of folk art and high modernism, deliberately flattened space, attention to geometric forms, and decorative surface patterns, with social critique. This scene, Sunday morning breakfast, was drawn from the artist's childhood memories and has a rustic warmth that lends dignity to the depiction of poverty. "I paint things exactly the way they are," Pippin once explained. "I don't do what these white guys do. I don't go around here making up a whole lot of stuff. I paint it exactly the way it is and exactly the way I see it." While Pippin remained loyal to his Philadelphia dealer, Robert Carlin, the artist eventually agreed to a solo exhibition at the Downtown Gallery in 1944, in which this painting was featured, and Halpert routinely included his work in group exhibitions at her gallery going forward. An important objective of Halpert's collaboration with Alan Locke, in addition to bringing African American art to a broad public, had been to convince her fellow American art dealers to add African American artists to their rosters, creating systemic change within the overwhelmingly white art world. Halpert modeled this behavior, becoming the first mainstream dealer in Manhattan to regularly promote the work of Black artists. And she and Jacob Lawrence would continue to work together for the next decade or so. She gave him about 7 solo exhibitions in that time. As fate would have it, however, her survey show opened the day after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. America's entry into World War II naturally shifted attention and resources away from domestic cultural concerns. Halpert's ambition to promote racial integration in the gallery system had limited impact, at least at the time. Still, in breaking racial barriers and including her peers to do the same, she played a crucial early role in establishing Black art as integral to the American art canon. World War II had a profound effect on other downtown gallery artists too. The Japanese-born painter Yasuo Kuniyoshi, who I know was also a beloved instructor at the Art Students League for many years, and whom Halpert had been supporting for over a decade, suddenly became an enemy alien. He was placed under house arrest and had his assets frozen. Halpert responded immediately, mounting a defiant exhibition of his work in April 1942. In the press release, she described his life as a characteristic American story of opportunity and success. It is the story of his assimilation and emergence in the American pattern. It is the story of the development of a great talent enriched by the opportunities in American life and in turn enriching that life. It is the story of art and life in a democracy. The exhibition presented 21 paintings, all on loan from major public and private collections, one from each year of his career, including the one you see here. Kuniyoshi later went on to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale just about a decade later. And I really believe that without Halpert's persistent framing of his work in an American context, it is unlikely that he would have achieved this national recognition in his lifetime. Halpert's forthright championing of social and political causes was just one way in which she maintained her relevance in her later years. But she was also incredibly savvy in her ability to navigate the general shift in the city's gallery scene beginning in the 1940s. During World War II and in the prosperous years after, everyday Americans began to purchase contemporary art regularly. Young professionals with unconventional tastes and disposable incomes appeared. In 1944, Halpert reported that almost half her sales were to clients making a first art purchase. This was a major change from the early days when she had to rely on the generosity of a few open-minded heiresses and industrialists. For example, among Halpert's most dependable clients at mid-century were Milton and Helen Kromer, a Manhattan couple who purchased small pictures on installment from her. With thrift and intelligence, they amassed a collection of more than 150 artworks, including Stuart Davis's study for Ready to Wear. And this is a very small, it's just like a little itty-bitty thing, but it's really packs a punch. Although individual works may not have been the biggest or best by any artist, together the ensemble created quite an impression in their home. Like so many of the great private collections Halpert helped to assemble, the Kromer's artworks were later donated to a public museum. In this case, it was the museum up at Cornell University where the couple had connections. In 1950, Look magazine even published an article about the Kromer's big little art collection, which they had purchased for $50 a month. So it just goes to show that back in the 1920s, when she introduced this installment plan concept, it was completely scandalous, and by the 1950s, it's like totally de rigueur and being celebrated in one of the most popular magazines. In the 1940s and 50s, Halpert used clever frameworks to encourage middle-class Americans to buy art. Gimmicky as these concepts may have been, they signaled that the downtown gallery was neither elitist nor intimidating. Art for the 67% was perhaps Halpert's most witty sales scheme, which was aimed at married couples. It was said that 67% of American adults were married in 1952. So in that exhibition, she displayed 2 artworks by each artist in the show, one for Mr. and one for Mrs. And both could be lent on approval so the pair could duke it out at home over which one to keep. And if Halpert was lucky, maybe they would keep both of them. Peter Bloom, south of Scranton, was included in one of Halpert's most remarkable marketing stratagems. This painting had won the prestigious Carnegie Prize, but it did not sell, perhaps because the enigmatic, almost surrealist scene with its homoerotic undertones was unpalatable to potential collectors at the time. So Halpert featured it in a 1941 exhibition she called "What is Wrong with This Picture?" It was a group show of paintings that had failed to find a buyer, a circumstance she commented that should make the critics and museums and collectors blush. She even handed out questionnaires to visitors, inviting them to answer the question posed by the exhibition's title. This may have been a sales ploy to drum up interest in leftover inventory, but her larger point was that taste is subjective and personal. People should trust their own judgment and buy what they like. And in fact, the following year, the Metropolitan Museum of Art purchased this canvas, so very successful. After the esteemed dealer Alfred Stieglitz died in 1946, Halpert capably courted his circle of American artists, including Arthur Dove, John Marin, and most significantly, Georgia O'Keeffe. The artist was best known for her images of magnified flowers and mountainscapes. Now Halpert highlighted her abstract compositions. It was an effort to recast her work in terms of its affinity with abstract expressionism, which by the mid-1950s was dominating the art scene. But crucially, it was also an effort by a businesswoman who had herself long resisted the pressures of masculine authority in her field to rewrite the sexist narrative that Stieglitz had imposed on O'Keeffe. He had consistently emphasized O'Keeffe's gender, both as her dealer and as her partner. From his alleged comment, "At last, a woman on paper," when he first encountered her art, to the highly erotic nude photographs he took and exhibited of her. According to Halpert, he had not only welcomed but initiated the sexualized readings of O'Keeffe's paintings. She explained, "This was an old man boasting of his prowess indirectly." The Downtown Gallery's presentation of O'Keeffe aimed to be done with that sex business, as she called it, focusing instead on the strength and expressiveness of her work. So this painting was actually in Halpert's personal collection, so I'd like to talk about that for just a minute as a means of wrapping things up. For years, Halpert had encouraged people to buy art for pleasure rather than for prestige or investment, and she followed her own advice. Throughout her career, she had been steadily building a collection of American art herself. In the end, her personal trove included approximately 500 works by some 50 modern artists and close to 500 American folk art objects. "There are a lot of gaps," she admitted. "You see, I've only bought the things I loved." We should all have such problems. Halpert had hoped to donate her art to a public institution, preferably in Washington, D.C. As late as the 1960s, there was still no significant collection of American modernism, or folk art for that matter, in the nation's capital. For years, she attempted to persuade the Corcoran Gallery to become the steward of her collection and to invest in building a new wing that would help to draw in additional gifts of American folk and modern art. But approved plans for this enterprise failed to materialize by her death in 1970. 3 years later, in 1973, her collection was dispersed at auction. Fittingly, the sale was one last marketing sensation for the gallerist, earning a record-breaking $3.95 million in 1973. And this is a picture of Halpert with some of the gems of her personal collection. I believe this was taken at the Corcoran when she had her collection on view there as part of her efforts to get the collection into the museum. So this sale, this posthumous sale, was record-breaking on many levels. Her version of Ellie Nodelman's Tango set the auction record for American sculpture, and Kuniyoshi's Little Joe with Cow was the highest bid of the whole affair. Georgia O'Keeffe became the most expensive living American artist when her poppies commanded $120,000 at this sale, which is like, you cannot buy a Georgia O'Keeffe for that now. You can buy a banana for that now. But anyway, she remains the highest valued female artist worldwide today. The auction house attributed this spectacular success to what they called the Halpert influence. Her name added value. A work with Halpert provenance was recognized to be of high quality. So the continued strength of the American art market, nearly 100 years after Halpert opened the Downtown Gallery, is a testament to her extraordinary vision and steadfast belief in the value, pure and simple, of American art. But Halpert's true legacy lies in the dozens of artists she discovered and sustained, who were able to live and make art because of her, in the many women in the arts she inspired, in her fierce support of artists who fell outside the mainstream, and perhaps most significantly, in the thousands of artworks that found their way through her into American public collections, usually without her name attached. So if today our understanding of American art is eclectic, diverse, generous in its parameters, and infused with idealism, we may in some part have Edith Halpert to thank. So I'm going to end it there. I leave you with two images. One is the cover of the catalog, which, if you'll allow me to brag for a moment, was named one of the top art books of 2019 by Roberta Smith. So if you liked what you heard today, there are many more such stories included in that catalog. And then this is an image of the final gallery in our show that's currently up at the Jewish Museum through February 9th with personal highlights, or highlights from her personal collection that have been reassembled for the first time since that 1973 sale. And you'll see that we also have provided you with some swivel chairs. You can get the full Halpert experience when you go. All right, I am here to answer any questions you may have.
All right.